In this section, this is the American Colonies Come of Age. So, types of colonies, you need to know these for your test. You need to know what a proprietary colony is, a royal colony, and a charter colony. Proprietary colonies are granted by a king or a queen to an individual or a group of people, and they make their own rules and laws as they wish in their colony. Royal colonies, just as it sounds, is controlled directly by the crown, directly by the king or queen, and a charter colony is given to a group of people or one person. They rule in the name of the king. Here are your southern colonies. Check out the geography there in yellow, but Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Here's a better map. So you need to know Maryland colony is created by Lord Baltimore as a haven for Roman Catholics being persecuted in England. And in 1649, you're going to read this, the Maryland Toleration Act was passed. Catholics were a minority in the New World, and basically this was protect the Catholics from the Protestants. It's the minority from persecution. The important thing you need to get is it sets precedent for religious freedom. This leads us on our way to where we look at it today and say, whatever religion you practice, Christian, Muslim, Buddhism, whatever. Okay, but originally it was to protect the Catholics from the Protestants, but today it has expanded. So Southern colonies, basically, the picture over there is Lord Hyde. He's the original proprietor of the Carolinas, and the Carolinas were given to 8 men, mostly for subsistence farming, growing enough to survive. This area became major exporters of naval stores, supplies for shipbuilding and repair. Hate to say it, but the land down south has better ports than the land up north early on. The port of Charleston is a really good port for ships back then. And of course, yes, they use slave labor on the plantations to create cash crops. So the Georgia colony, James Oglethorpe was the proprietor. As a matter of fact, his plantation, his farm plantation was right outside of Savannah, just east of Savannah. But if you look, Georgia was a refuge for debtors. Back then, when you went into debt and couldn't pay your debts, you went into prison. So this was a debtor's prison refuge. In other words, basically as a refuge for debtors, they could come to Georgia and start a new life from England. If you look, Oglethorpe, he barred alcohol in the colony and slavery. So in old Georgia, they didn't even have slavery way back in the day. Southern colonies make up nearly half of the colonial population. As you see, the warm climate, fertile soil spurred the plantation system. What is the plantation system? It's basically these huge farms, and they produce cash crops. And as you see here in Virginia, North Carolina, tobacco were big. South Carolina and Georgia was rice. And South Carolina also grew indigo. Not to totally leave out North Carolina from rice. We grew rice in North Carolina as well. If you've ever heard of Orton Plantation, that was a rice farm. And if you've ever been to the Smith Creek coming in from the river, if you've noticed the very narrow weeds growing, seagrass growing, that's because that used to be a rice farm there as well. So the New England colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. There's a better picture of them in green. Keep in mind, Maine was part of Massachusetts. And they don't get along today, by the way, interestingly enough. Plymouth colony, first successful colony in New England. Remember, that's established in 1620. Searching for religious freedom. Some people wanted a pure type of church. Others wanted a separate church completely. Pilgrims who got here first in 1620, they were separatists. All right, William Bradford, he wrote an account of Pilgrim life entitled Plymouth Plantation. So they came over here, the Pilgrims did, seeking religious freedom. About 100 sailed over. As you see, the Mayflower Compact was written, but it was written on board the Mayflower. So they actually signed this document aboard the Mayflower. It's the first form of direct democracy in the New World. It's still seen in New England town meetings, and it sets precedent for self-rule. What a town meeting is, or what a direct democracy is every person in the town votes on every issue directly. So over half died on the first winter. The next year, the natives taught them how to farm, putting fish in the dirt, using it as fertilizer, things like that. It is this fall, 1621, in October of 1621, they celebrated the first Thanksgiving. Go check out the original Thanksgiving menu. It looks a lot different than the one we have today. And this is the only Thanksgiving they celebrated. This was it until President Lincoln made it a national holiday in 1864. New England Colonies, Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans settled this area in 1630, 10 years after the Pilgrims came over. John Winthrop, you need to underline him. He is the leader of the Puritan colony. He was a lawyer in England. He is the one who said, we're going to create a city upon a hill. You'll hear presidents still reference this today, like President Obama was the last one to reference, we want to be a city on a hill. It comes from this, and basically it means we want to be a city, we want to be a culture where everybody in the world looks up to. They believed they were creating a new pure society to serve God, one for all to admire. No tolerance for different religious beliefs. It's our way or the highway, so you're going to have a lot of dissenters, people who disagreed with the Puritan church. Anne Hutchinson will be one. Roger Williams, 3 years before her, was forced out. And Thomas Hooker, who creates Connecticut. The Salem witch trials happened in this colony. Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth will eventually combine to form Massachusetts. So religious dissent is common in this area. A number of religious reformers split from the Puritan church to found colonies where religious freedom was acceptable. Roger Williams being one, and Hutchinson being another. And Hutchinson believed everyone could communicate directly with God. Roger Williams, he had two beliefs. One was the land was not theirs. They should ask the natives if they should be on the land. And another one was he said the same thing. Basically, you didn't need the church for worship. Everybody could communicate with God. So the Salem witch trials in 1692, Salem, Massachusetts. Several girls were accused of being witches. West African lady, servant out in the woods teaching the girls African dances, and of course people saw it and thought they were witches. But what this thing really shows is the gap between rich and poor. Quarrelsome neighbors, mainly women, are going to be accused of witchcraft because that's the easy way for richer men in the neighborhood or richer men in the city, town to get rid of those quarrelsome women. As you see, the hysteria followed, and 20 men and women were executed as witches and warlocks, including one dog. They actually executed a dog. So this was a mass hysteria. Intolerance prevailed in this area. It's basically a dark chapter in New England history. Think of some of today's witch hunts. You'll be getting into, think about the political witch hunts. Think about Think about the Red Scare of the 1950s when you get to American II. Think about the Red Scare of the 1920s in U.S. history. So we do see this mass hysteria even today. And you can think about our modern day pandemic is, people sometimes get hysterical about that. Roger Williams, as you see here, he founded Rhode Island after being banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He said we should pay Indians. We should pay Indians for the use of the land, and he suggested a separation of church and state. Basically, he believed that government shouldn't be run by the church. So these two things set precedent, and he also agreed with Ann Hutchinson of everybody could communicate with God directly. Thomas Hooker founds Connecticut after being banished from Massachusetts. He writes or he helps write the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It is the first written constitution in America, and that sets precedent. You're going to read that as well. The New England Colonies, type of economy they have. Agriculture is discouraged because of the rocky, hilly soil. There are some self-sufficient farms and towns around, but mainly New England's going to be dependent on long-distance trade. The largest city, of course, was Boston. Fishing, shipbuilding were more important than farming, and they were part of the triangular trade network. There is an oversimplification of the triangular trade network. So here's what triangular trade is. And guys, this is very oversimplified, but it was a lot more complex than this. However, stage one, raw materials go to Europe: tobacco, rum, sugar. Manufactured goods go to Africa, like guns, clothing, cloth, and rum. Rum was a big one. And then, of course, slaves would go to the Americas to make raw materials. And where were these slaves ended up? They ended up mainly in the Caribbean, where you could get the sugar and the sugar cane for rum. That's what a slave should look like. So Europeans began to use slave labor in their colonies to grow crops, mine, etc. Native Americans were used for a while, but Africans began to be brought over to the Americas. Native Americans would run away. They knew the land better than Europeans. So the slave trade then became the main focus of Europe's relations with Africa. So this up here tells you a little bit about the slave trade if you want to watch it. But the Middle Passage is the name given to a particular part of the trade, triangular trade that went between Africa and the Americas, bearing the enslaved Americans. Keep in mind, these trade ships were also slavers. They just convert the merchant ships into slaves. They would have all the equipment on board to do that. Slaves were captured by other Africans and sold to Europeans in exchange for weapons. Here's where most slaves went. 67% of all slaves went to the Caribbean, 13% went to Brazil, and only 4% went to North America. So keep that in mind. What's going on in the Caribbean? Sugar plantations. So the Middle Colonies, New York, Delaware, New Jersey. The Middle Colonies, as you see, Pennsylvania colony established by William Penn in 1681. Penn wanted to establish a society that practiced religious toleration. Many members of the colony were Quakers. They protested, or they were a Protestant group that believed in nonviolence. They felt that all people should be treated as equals, and they treated Native Americans equally. They had very good relations with Native Americans. So the breadbasket, the Middle Colonies, as you see. Type of economy in the Middle Colonies, as you see, is known as the breadbasket because farms produce vegetables, grains, and important cash crops like wheat and corn. So it's a mixture of farming and commerce. Small manufacturing of glass, textiles. New York and Philadelphia were the largest cities in North America. So the Middle Colonies did it all. They farmed and they practiced their commerce. We'll pick up with part 2 next.